Hey students, Professor Quinn here. In a previous video, I provided an overview of the 3 files used in a JavaFX project and set up Scene Builder to run in NetBeans. If you're not familiar with this content, I've provided a link in the description below. In this video and its sequel, we will build a JavaFX GUI. After you complete this 2-video sequence, you will have a student information form that collects the first and last name from the user and displays this information to standard output. We will go through a demo first, then we will begin the tutorial. When you finish this 2-video sequence called Building a JavaFX GUI with a Maven Project, you will have a form that collects a user's first and last name. The GUI will include an anchor pane, which is an invisible container that holds all of the objects that you see here. The form will also have a label with the title of the form, which is student information, and 2 labels that identify the information that the user should type into the text fields. The first label is the first name, and you'll notice to the right of this label is a text field for inputting the information. The second label is the last name. To the right of this label is also a text field which will receive last name input from the user. The labels and the text fields are organized and aligned in an invisible container with rows and columns called the grid pane. Lastly, there is a button which the user can click after the input is complete. To provide a demo, I will type Professor in the first name box. I will type Quinn in the last name box. When I am done, I will click the Submit button and you will see that the input is displayed in standard output. Next, I will explain the skills that you will learn by completing the first video. In this tutorial, we will build a JavaFX GUI. We will create FXML files that contain controls like labels, image views, text fields, and buttons. We will build these controls without writing code. Instead, we will be using the JavaFX Scene Builder. We will arrange the GUI components using 2 layout containers, the VBox and the grid pane. Let's get started. We will begin by extracting the zipped Maven file. You may have already done this if you completed the steps in the previous tutorial. The zipped Maven file can be found as a link in the description below. To extract these files, we'll open to the Downloads folder or whatever directory you stored the file in. Next, we'll right-click the file and choose Extract All. We'll click the Browse button and we'll select the Documents folder, NetBeans Projects, and we'll click the Select Folder button. We'll click Extract and the files will be extracted to the NetBeans Project folder. We'll close these windows and we'll open NetBeans. We will begin by opening the project in NetBeans. We'll click the Open Project button on the toolbar, and from our NetBeans projects, we'll select Basic JavaFX. We'll click the Open Project button, and the project appears in the Projects pane. If we wanted to test the program, we could click the Run button, and in just a moment, we should see the project run. Again, I can test by clicking the Click Me button, and you'll notice the Hello World label appears, and You Click Me appears in the standard output. I'll close this window. Next, I'm going to rename Basic JavaFX. If I right-click the project name and choose rename, I can select a new name. For our purposes, we're going to be creating a form, so I'll call it Form JavaFX. I'm also going to change the artifact ID. Notice the naming convention for artifacts is all lowercase letters. And lastly, I'll rename the folder. This is the folder where the project is stored. I'll click OK, and you can see now the project name has been changed, the artifact ID has been changed, and if I open my folder to the NetBeans projects folder, the name of this folder has also been changed. Next, let's work on the fxml file. I'll come to my project, expand, and I'll go into Other Sources to open my fxml file. Remember, it's under Sources, Main Resources, the fxml package, and here we named our fxml file scene.fxml. If I right-click the file and choose Edit, I can view the code in a code window. If I double-click scene.fxml, I can open this file in the Scene Builder. When the Scene Builder opens, you'll notice a GUI displays. If we look at the hierarchy, you'll notice here is the anchor pane, which is a layout container, the button, and the label. So the anchor pane is a container that's going to store the various objects, like the button that we see here, and the label, which is hidden from us but appears slightly below the button. For hidden components, sometimes it's easier to work with the anchor pane. I can select a control in the anchor pane to highlight it. Notice here I could click on the label and not have to guess as to where the object is stored. The next thing I'd like to do is I'd like to take a look at our controller. If I click on the controller pane, you'll notice that the controller class is displayed here. If you remember from our earlier tutorial, the controller class contains the code that will run when the button is clicked. I'm going to get rid of all of the elements that I have here, and in the process, I'm going to lose the information that I have in the controller class. So I'm going to select that information now and choose Control-C to copy it. Now when I go back to the hierarchy, if I click the anchor pane and press Delete on the keyboard, I'm asked if I want to delete this control, this component, and delete all the components that are underneath of it. I'll select Delete, and you'll notice everything is gone. Next, we're going to add a new container. So I'm going to come down here and select another anchor pane, and I'll drag it into the staging area. Now notice when I add this new anchor pane, if I go back to the controller class is empty. We're going to click in the controller class box, and we're going to paste the controller class information back in from what we had previously copied. If we forget to do this step, we can always type the information back in here. Remember, this is nothing more than the information that we have from our package where the fxml controller is stored. Again, it's the package name and the fxml controller. Realize it's the class, not the file name. If it were the file name, it would say fxml.java. Instead, it's the class name, which is just fxml controller. Again, notice here in the scene builder, .java is not at the end of the controller class name. We created our anchor pane before, and now what we're going to do is we're going to add a control to it. If I click the controls pane, you'll notice it lists controls that are available to me, and I could scroll through the list. One important point to make about these panes is that they do limit the number of items that you can see if another pane is opened. So for example, you'll notice that the Documents pane here is taking up quite a bit of space. If I place my mouse slightly above the word Documents on the line here, I can click and drag down to get additional space to show different controls. If I want to work again with the hierarchy or the controller, I can always click and drag back up again. The control that I want to add is a label control. To add this control, like I did with the anchor pane, I simply click the control and drag it onto the screen. Notice over here, if I place this on the anchor pane right in the middle, I will see a red line indicating I'm on the middle. As I move this around, this is the far right-hand side, and this is the far left-hand side. Notice the top is also delimited or delineated, and the bottom is delineated with these red lines. So let's place it about dead center, and we'll move it down just a little bit here. The next thing that I want to do is I want to change the text inside of the label. Okay, to do that, I want to be over here on the inspector pane, and I want to go into the properties. You'll notice that the first property is called text, and this is where I can change the label. Okay, I can change the label here. I'll call it student information. You'll notice that the information doesn't change here until I move out of the box. So if I were to press enter, okay, or click on the box over here, it would change this information. Next, I might want to change the font. I can click the drop down arrow, and I can choose different families of font. For example, I might want to go with a different look to this. I'll go with just simple Arial. I might want to change the style to bold. And I can either change the size by using the drop down arrow here, or I could use the slider here. Let's go with 32. Now, as a result of moving things around, you may have noticed that this information slides over to the right. It's no longer centered. I can simply click on the box and drag back to the center, noticing the red line will appear when I get this placed in the center of the screen. If we take a look at our hierarchy now, we'll notice that the label is now contained within the anchor pane. The next thing I might want to do is give this label an ID. To do this, I'll come over to the Code tab, and I'll click in the ID box. For this particular label, I'm going to give it a 3-letter tag, LBL, and then I'm going to name it Student Information. You can choose any name you want as long as it doesn't have spaces or special characters. The reason I'm giving it the name LBL is because I want to be able to identify the type of control that it is. I use LBL for labels. You'll see later that I'll use TXT for text fields and CMD for buttons. When I'm finished creating the label, I can move on to the next control. The next thing I want to do is add another container for creating a table-like effect. The name of this container is the grid pane. I'll click Containers and find Grid Pane. I'll click and drag the grid pane into my staging area, and I'll try to center it. You'll notice I get the red crosshairs to indicate it's right in the center of the staging area. I let go, and you'll notice that I have now a 2-column, 3-row grid. This grid will allow me to organize content in rows and columns. You'll notice that I can make modifications to the grid. For example, I can insert and delete columns by clicking on a column and then right-clicking the column. You can choose Delete to delete this column. You could also move the columns, add rows above and below, and add columns above and below. If I wanted to add a column, I could choose to add a column after, and you'll notice a new column is added. If I want to delete this column, I can right-click the column with the column selected and choose Delete. The same goes for rows. I can take out a row by simply clicking on the row marker and then right-clicking and choosing Delete. For this particular table, I only need 2 rows and 2 columns, so I'll leave the layout with what I have now. The nice thing about the grid pane is that I can add controls, and the controls will align nicely without any additional work. Let's go ahead and add some controls now. First, I'll click on the controls pane, and I'm going to add 2 labels. First, I'll click and drag labels, and as I place it in the grid area, you'll notice that I can choose where this label is going to go. I'll place it in the top left corner. Next, I'll add another label, and I'll place it in the second row, first column. Now we're going to add 2 text fields. I'll scroll down to find my text fields in the controls area, and I'll click and drag a text field. Next, I'll add the second text field. And we now have 4 controls that are contained within the grid pane. If I make the hierarchy a little bit larger, you can see here that these labels and text fields are now situated within the grid pane. It shows me that 00 is the location of the first label. That's going to be in the first column, first row. The next one is located in the first column, second row. It's always one more than the number that's indicated here. The text fields, this is going to be the second column, first row. And the second text field is the second column, second row. Again, it's always one more than the number you see over here to the right. Whenever we reference rows and columns, we always reference the column first. So you'll notice here inside of parentheses we have 1, 1. Remember, we're going to add 1 to the values, so this will be the second column, second row. The comma separates the rows from the columns. Next, we're going to give an ID to our 2 text fields. It's very important that we give IDs to every control we interact with in our code. Without these IDs, we wouldn't be able to reference the controls in our code. We'll start with the first text field. If we come to the code pane, we can click in the ID field and we'll type txt underscore first name. The txt indicates the type of field that we're working with. In this case, we're working with a text field control. The first name indicates the type of information that this field is going to store. In our case, we're going to gather first name and last name information for our students. Next, let's do the same thing for our last name. We'll click in the text box here, we'll click in the ID field, and type txt underscore last name. For the label, we could do the same thing, but since we're not doing any programming with the labels, let's just give the label a text property. I'll click on the label, and I'll click on Properties. Notice it tells me the control that I'm working with. If it doesn't indicate the right control, you might be changing the wrong control. We'll go into the text field, and we'll change label to first name. This is what we want the user to see. We'll do the same thing for the second label. We'll change the text to indicate that this is for the last name. With the first and last name fields identified here, the user will know exactly what information to type into the 2 text boxes. I'll click away, and we can see what the form looks like at this point. Next, I'm going to modify the layout. First, I'll come over to the hierarchy and I'll click the grid pane. This ensures that the grid pane is selected. Then I'm going to come over to the resize handle, and you'll notice I get a two-headed arrow. I'll click and drag to the right, and as I do, you'll notice that both the 0 column and the 1 column become larger. They're the same size. If I want the 0 column to be smaller than the 1 column, I can place my mouse between the two columns and I can click and drag. You'll notice that column 0 is now smaller, but the grid pane is slightly to the right now. To move this, I'm just simply going to place my mouse above the label. Notice I get the white arrow, and I'm going to click and drag to the right until I see the red centering line. I let go, and my grid pane is now centered. Now I'm going to add a little bit of space between all of the controls. If I click off the grid pane, you'll notice that the controls are kind of close together. I'm going to select each control holding the Shift key. So first I click on the text field at the top. I'll hold Shift and click the second text field. This highlights over here on the right both text fields. If I click last name and first name, all four of these controls are now highlighted. What I can do now is modify the properties of all four fields simultaneously. I'm going to add a little bit of margin by adding over here 10 pixels. This is going to add 10 pixels to the top. You'll notice 10 pixels is added. I'll add 10 pixels to the right. Notice this icon indicates a slightly darker shading on the right hand side, so this is right margin. I'll press tab. I can add additional margin at the bottom, and I can add margin on the left. Now when I'm done, you'll notice that right now the columns aren't quite where they were before. It's cut off part of my label. That's an easy enough fix. I'll simply click on the grid pane again, and I'm going to drag the column split to the right slightly. When I click off of the grid pane, you'll notice that all of the items now have a little bit more spacing between them. The last control that I want to add is a button. I'll come over to my controls pane and I'll scroll up to the very, very top. You'll notice button can be found at the top of the list, and I'll click and drag it into the anchor pane area. Once again, the anchor pane allows me to place this wherever I want. I'm going to line it up over here, and I'm going to change the ID and the label. I'm giving it the name CMD Submit because this button will submit the information of the first and last name. In the properties, I'll now assign the text to the button that I want the user to see. Here I'll simply type the text Submit. I'll press Enter, and this information goes onto the button. One last thing, if I wanted to tighten up the way that this window looks, I can move things a little bit closer together and have a smaller window. You'll notice I may have to recenter. Click on the control first before you move it. As a finishing touch, I'm going to add a picture of a student that I got from Creative Commons in the public domain. Now I'm going to go into the Downloads folder and copy the file. First I go to Downloads. You'll notice it's a simple JPEG file. I'll right-click and copy, and I'm going to paste this file into the FXML folder. So I come over to Documents, NetBeans Projects. Here's the project that I'm working in. I'll go to Source, Main, Resources, FXML, and you'll notice here's my scene.fxml file. I'll right-click and paste this picture into the same folder. This is the easiest place for us to access this file. Now I'm going to rename the file. I right-click and I'll choose Rename. I'll give this a file name like Student Image. From here, I'll go back to the Scene Builder and I'll add an Image View control. I'll click Image View, I'll drag it into the anchor pane, and now all that's left is adding the image. I'll come over to the three dots, which is called the Build button, and I'll select the student image. This is why I mentioned the easiest place to place this is in the FXML file folder. I'll click Open, and you'll notice the student image appears. I'll resize it, and I'll move it next to the student information title. Just to check our work, we might want to click off of this, and then click the Preview tab, Show Preview in Window, and I can see what the GUI will look like when I run it in NetBeans. I'll close this window, and I'll save my changes. If I go back to NetBeans now, and I display the FXML file, you'll notice that the changes that we've made are now reflected as text. You can see the columns, you can see the rows, you can see the grid pane, you can see the text fields, and you can see the image. All of the changes that we made to the controls in the Scene Builder have now been converted to text as FXML code. We are now finished working with the FXML file. In the next tutorial, we will turn our attention to the FXML controller.